Of all the post-Roman national family origins, written for rulers in the north, only one begins with a woman, the Lombards. Early legendary accounts for them, except for England which was later, call these people Winili. In the 7th century, a nameless author of the Origo Gentis Langobardorum, origin of the Longobard nation, wrote of a seeress, a female prophet or sorceress, amongst the Winili people named Gambara. Her 2 sons, Ibor and Agio, ruled over the Winili. In this legend, they were still in Scandinavia, though Paul the Deacon, writing about them in the late 8th century, places them in northern Germany. In this story, the Winili were faced with an enemy from the tribe of the Vandals, who pushed the Winili to pay them tribute. Gambara told her sons to refuse, meaning war with the Vandals for their independence. With her sons, they invoke the pagan goddess Freya. This goddess answers Gambara, urging her to have the women drape their hair over their faces to disguise themselves as men joining the battle. The goddess Freya woke her husband Odin, who then turned and looked at the Winili women, with hair covering their faces, and said, "Who are these Longbeards?" And as such, the Longobards or Longbeards became their name, from which came Lombard. His wife Freya said to him, "Since you have given them a name, will you not give them victory in battle?" Odin agreed, and gave the Winili, now the Lombards, victory over the Vandals. In truth, the name Longbard probably just came from the men, being northerners with long beards, that helped to keep them warm in winter. And Paul the Deacon, clearly a zealous Christian, noted how silly this legend was. In any case, Ibor and Agio consulted their mother again after this victory. She wanted them to move south. That the Lombards began in Scandinavia is doubtful, actually. On at least 3 accounts, they probably formed after other migrations from Scandinavia, raising awareness of themselves as a people in northern Germany. 1. Paul the Deacon is not the only one to suggest a northwest German origin. The Greek geographer Strabo, over 7 centuries before him, wrote that they were driven in flight out of their country into a land on the far side of the Elbe. According to Strabo, the Lombards were nomads. Whilst this does not cancel out a Scandinavian origin, it puts them in northwest Germany quite early, and is seen with the Goths, Vandals, Gepids, and other peoples who migrated from Scandinavia. Those people tended to move east, not west. Second, the Roman historian Tacitus notes in the 1st century that they called themselves Winili, not Lombards. And from him and Ptolemy, we know that the Vandals lived in what is today Poland. It looks like the Vandals attempted to expend their power west to the River Elbe and were defeated. The clash between these 2 nations happened in today's Germany, not Scandinavia. But that in itself does not mean that they did not have roots further north. Some German scholars think that the battle could have been on the Baltic coast. There may have been a conflict over trade routes in the Baltic Sea. We don't know. It was just so far beyond civilization. Thirdly, for the Anglo-Saxons to be so familiar with them does reinforce they may have been neighbors a few centuries before, in today's northwest Germany. What seems logical to me is these people had some ancestry in Scandinavia, but that was already being forgotten by the late Roman period. So they created myths about where they came from, but their identity was formed in northern Germany. That's just my opinion. Let me know what you think below. During the late 1st century BCE, the Roman Empire built a military presence east of the Rhine. Strabo wrote that the Lombards were a branch of the Suebi people, who were positioned between the Elbe to the east and the Rhine to the west. This would mean the Lombards faced a serious military threat from the Roman Empire. The historian Tacitus notes that the Lombards were fighting to defend their newly won freedom. He doesn't mention from who. In his Annals, Tacitus writes that the Lombards were loosely part of the Maribod kingdom under the Marcomanni. or along their northwestern border paying them tribute. If this is so, they may have won a war of independence against the Vandals in the century before, and then fell under sway of an expanding Marabot kingdom of the Macromani people. The most pragmatic and sensible move in this position would have been to turn to Arminius, the leader of the Cherusci, a charismatic leader trying to form an alliance of Germanic tribes to their west to fight Rome, and his victory over Rome in the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in year 9 was a turning point in history. 3 whole Roman legions were wiped out, ending attempts by Rome to colonize further east. One of the worst defeats in the history of Rome, and the Lombards are said to have taken part in this battle. With the Lombards having won 2 major battles and secured their independence, it is a mystery as to why they migrated from their new homeland along the Elbe River, present-day Hamburg. Roman historian Cassius Dio notes that in the years leading up to the Macromanic Wars between the Macromani and Rome, around 6,000 Lombards invaded present-day Hungary. They were defeated and pushed back. But it does show Lombards were thinking about lands further south. The Macromani Wars in the late 2nd century engulfed almost every Germanic tribe and the Roman Empire, including the Lombards. But given they were further to the north along the Elbe, the Lombards were spared the massive population losses further south, which these wars caused. This would also explain why lands to the south were now theirs for the taking. After both sons, Ubor and Agio, had died, the Lombards elected a new king. They chose the son of Agio, named Agilmund. We don't know much about Agilmund, other than he reigned for around 30 years, and we get the sense he was a good king. The Historia written by Paul the Deacon notes the Lombards fell under the rule of the Saxons around the year 300, and that Agilmund organized a resistance and threw off their rule, winning the Lombards their freedom as a people. Clearly the chronology is not clear. There's a missing century or 2 perhaps, but these are mythical kings still. If there is some truth here, maybe their migration southward was to get away from all of these enemies who kept trying to rule over them. The History Longobardum says Agilmund led his people to fight the Boivindis, seizing their lands. Given this text was written in the late 8th century, we can judge from the Latin used that this means Bohemians, the former lands of the Macromani. The River Elbe was a superhighway between Central Europe and the trade routes of the northern seas. It looks like the Lombards moved in along this river and took out whoever was living there in today's Czechia, but they had to deal with Huns now and other Eurasian peoples. They were clearly ruled by the Huns for a while and suffered under this. At some point it is said Agilmund was killed in battle by the Bulgars. A king named Lomisio came to power after him. There are a couple legends around him which echo heroic, ancient Greek storytelling. His mother was a prostitute who gave birth to 7 boys at once, and he fought an Amazonian, a woman, who tried to stop the Lombards from crossing a river. As Paul the Deacon notes, these are fanciful tales. I mean, well, of course he would say that, he is a Christian, but they are fanciful tales, to be fair. Lomisio then takes revenge on the Bulgars. How true this war with the Bulgars is, we can only guess. But it does show a cultural gravity shifting further south, toward the Mediterranean world. How long their migration took from the lower Elbe to Bohemia, present-day Czechia, is not clear. But they did leave relatives in present-day Thuringia, and their next move to Austria is beginning to reach the historical record. Not quite, but almost. They're kind of on the edge of known history here. The next king, Goduok, is said to have led them into the kingdom of Rugiland. I need to point out 2 things here. Bohemia means the land of the boy, a Celtic people who left a lasting impact in the area. See my video on the boy. Second, Goduog sounds quite Welsh to my ear. Is it possible that a Celtic influence was still felt in Bohemia and Austria in the 5th century. I don't think it is out of possibility, and given that Tacitus said they were a small people, it could be one of their strategies was to welcome other groups into their tribe to grow their numbers, and maybe they absorbed Celtic speakers. But I digress, that is a guess on my part. The Historia lists a couple mythical kings, but the Lombards are pressing closer and closer towards civilization and recorded history. We know in the middle of the 5th century, the Lombards entered Lower Austria and aligned themselves with Gothic Odoacer, who was preparing to invade Italy. He would go on to end the Western Roman Empire. But for our Lombards, together with Gothic Odoacer and other tribes, they crushed the Alans in battle in 475 or early 476. This allowed the Lombards to settle along what was the traditional Roman border. They then came into Rugiland, the kingdom of the Rugi. These people, the Rugi, had migrated from Norway to what is now Hungary, north of the Danube, and built a short-lived kingdom. Yeah, I'm laughing because that's a long way, but it hammers home a point. Whole nations were moving all over the place, and the Lombards were just one of many in the chaos of a Europe in which the Western Empire was breaking apart. As I said before, the Marcomannic Wars of the 2nd century were important. It told of things to come. The Western Roman Empire ended because of the same and similar ethnic groups the empire was unable to control or assimilate in the Marcomannic Wars. Whatever our politicians today want to say about multiculturalism, we are not all the same. And if you are foolish enough to believe we are, the fall of the Western Roman Empire tells us that bringing incompatible cultures into your lands will lead to 300 years of mess. The Lombards, who had fought in the Marcomannic Wars 2 centuries earlier, burst across what had been the Roman frontier. They held what is now Vienna and were pushing toward Budapest in Hungary. The Lombards had it good for a brief moment. No one messed with them. They had peace when almost everyone around them was at war with everyone else. Following Godeoch, a King Claffo reigned, and after him, King Tato came to power. King Tato was a good king, or we can see he probably was, since the Lombards expanded their territory and grew their population, whilst nations around them like the Rugi and Alemanni shrank or vanished into other peoples. The Heruli people next door did not like that the Lombards were getting a bit too big for their shoes. Kind of like if you have a next door neighbor who drives a Honda Civic and you go buy a Lamborghini. It's not the best way to make friends, is it? The Lombards seem to have gotten rich off of the amber trade by controlling the Bohemian Gap in the mountains between the Baltic Sea and Italy, a lucrative place to control in those days. King Rudolf of the Heruli got angry, and in the rising tension, King Tato's daughter killed King Rudolf's son. I don't want to judge, but if a woman kills a man, it may have been because he had his way or tried to. In any case, war broke out in the year 508. The two armies met in battle to fairly settle their differences, and the Heruli lost. The Lombards took their gold and kicked the Heruli out of their former lands. However, King Tato was then killed by a nephew. King Tato was killed by King Wacko, or King Wacho. King Wacho kept the Franks at bay by marrying his daughter to the Frankish king Theudebert I. They now firmly held the western Pannonian plain, which meant they were playing at the level of big boys now. The Frankish kingdom and its tributary barbarian states were to their west and northwest, the Ostrogothic kingdom to their southwest, the Gepid kingdom to their east, and the Byzantine Empire along their south. As I mentioned in my video on the kingdom of the Gepids, the Lombards aligned with the Byzantine Empire, and then wrestled themselves into a position which roughly split the Pannonian plain evenly between them and the Gepids, which meant one of them had to die. A son of Wacho took the throne in 539, named Walthari, who was still a child. Children who become kings did not usually reach adulthood in the Dark Ages. This was an age when most full-grown kings were assassinated, taken out by coups d'etats, died in battle, or fell victim to plague. On top of this, the Byzantine Empire was ruled by Justinian the Great, not someone you messed with, whilst the Gepid kingdom next door was trying to recover from its blows in time to wipe the Lombards out. So let me ask you a question, my friends. Would you kill the child king to save your people from being conquered and potentially enslaved, or not? Another of King Waco's son, a brother by another mother, named Auduin, was installed as a regent over young Waltheri, and Auduin had a history to consider before deciding whether to kill the young king or not. For the moment, having a child between him and any assassination daggers was quite useful, but if someone else stormed the palace with a small group of men and then killed the child, he would lose and be killed too. He had to look at the international situation. If an external threat arose, then Auduin, who ruled the kingdom in all but name, could not afford a child on the throne. The Lombards would not be taken seriously. For the moment, Auduin used the Lombards' historic alliance with the Byzantine Empire to keep peace. But he had to keep his eyes elsewhere too. The Lombards still had political and family connections in Thuringia, which is what is now central Germany. Auduin's half-brother Hermanfrid ruled Thuringia, which gave him an ally and a buffer between him and the Frankish Empire. However, when Hermanfrid lost the Battle of Unstrut in 531, he became vassal to the Franks and was murdered shortly after by being thrown off a town wall when offering peace to King Theodoric of the Franks. This put the Lombards in a dangerous spot to have a child on their throne. The Frankish kingdom, even though divided by Clovis's sons, was not a joke. The Lombards could not win a war against the Franks yet. To his south, the Byzantine Empire was busy preparing for war in Italy, and as he acted as regent to the throne, Auduin signed a treaty with the Byzantines in 541. This strengthened the Lombards both in Pannonia and Italy. To his east, his main rival the Gepids were healing after a few bruises. He could not wait forever to fight them, but it was not a war either kingdom wanted. The Gepids and the Lombards were about equal in strength. With no natural borders between them, neither knew who would win. On top of this, since the death of the Gothic king Theodoric the Great in 526, the Lombardic economy with its trade dependent on Italy was in ruins. The Gepids, who had suffered in the 520s, were reuniting under a king named Elamund by the 540s. Sitting between the Frankish Empire and the ambitious, warlike Gepids meant that having a child on the throne was just stupid. The historian Proprius says the child died by disease. Almost everyone else says Auduin killed him. I'll give you one guess as to who the next Lombard king was. King Auduin ruled for over 20 years and expanded further into the Pannonian Plain. In the west, war broke out in Italy between the Ostrogoths and the Byzantine Empire. The war damaged the Lombard economy by drying up trade routes, but it was proved an opportunity for Auduin to strengthen his alliance with the Byzantines, because the Franks of Austrasia, under Theudebert, joined the Byzantines against the Ostrogoths, and then betrayed them. Whilst Franks were fighting Byzantines and Ostrogoths were fighting both Franks and Byzantines, King Auduin took action. He gave Justinian the Great soldiers to fight in Italy, which sealed his alliance for the duration of the war. This meant Auduin could attack the Gepids without either the Frankish Empire or the Byzantine Empire getting involved. He defeated the Gepids in battle in 552, killing the Gepid heir to the throne in the process. See my video on the Gepids. It was a great victory for the Lombards, but he was unable to finish off the Gepids without angering the Byzantine Empire, nor did the Gepids give up. The new Gepid king Thurisind, with a strong hold in Transylvania, was more diplomatic. There was peace for the remainder of the Gepid king Thurisind's reign. The Lombard king Auduin died in 563 or maybe 565. His son, Alboin, came to the throne to be king of the Lombards. As I noted in my video on the Gepids, a war to the death broke out between the Lombards and the Gepids. Once and for all, the conflict both feared came to them. The Gepids began to win the war. All was going well for the Gepids, but the diplomatic king Thorismund was no longer on the Gepid throne. King Cunimund ruled the Gepid kingdom, and whilst he played all of his cards well, he made one foolish mistake. If he had not only made one ungentlemanly move, he promised the Byzantines he would hand over the city of Sirmium if they helped him, and they did help him, but he refused to give them what he promised. King Cunimund lied. He was not a gentleman, so the Byzantines withdrew their support, and King Alboin launched a counterattack into the Gepid kingdom, whilst building another alliance with the Avars to the east. King Alboin trapped the Gepids without the Byzantines to help them, and destroyed their kingdom in 567. Despite this great victory, young King Alboin made one mistake as well, that any gentleman would not have made. He took the daughter of the Gepid king, her name was Rosamund, as his wife, after having killed her father and brothers, and forced her to drink from a cup made from the skull of her father. He then mistreated her woefully in public. Gentlemen, never give the female sex reason for revenge. They will wait years for revenge, and that is exactly what Queen Rosamund did. For now, however, Justinian the Great had died, and his successor, Justinian II, failed to stop barbarian tribes from crossing the Danube River. This allowed the Avars to sweep over Pannonia, present-day Western Romania and Hungary. King Alboin of the Lombards now faced two choices. Both involved war against former allies. War against the Avars or war against the Byzantines. Either choice was dangerous, but with Italy having suffered war for 20 years, King Alboin saw that its frontier garrisons would be deserted and its population in the north far less, where a few Ostrogoths still held out against the Byzantines, who might rise up and join him. The economy of Italy was in such a state that he could sweep in theory, and take over. But there were also other actors in play who would want to kill him. Fighting the Avars along the Danube River would be far easier in the sense that there was only one enemy, but the Avars were nomadic horsemen. Any war with them would be unpredictable. So would he take the unpredictable enemy who was one enemy, or would he invade Italy and perhaps have 2 or 3 enemies who were worn out after fighting each other? Only now in our distant future can we see how wise King Alboin's choice was. The Avars built an empire ruled by a Khan, a Khaganate, carved out in bloodshed over the next 250 years. I don't know what I would have done in this situation. Do you fight a bunch of insane savage horsemen erupting out of the Eurasian steppe? Or do you invade a relic of the empire that's been ground to dust, which might incur the mortal wrath of the empire further east, wiping your people out? Against the counsel of a majority of his nobles, he chose to move the nation to Italy. Some would say the art of keeping power is about stability and avoiding moves which induce chaos or unpredictability. In this regard, King Alboin made the choice which was the more predictable move, and that was a wise move. Rather than fight nomadic horsemen with a war that was unpredictable, he chose a strategy of attacking the very edge of the empire and a single city in Italy to test the waters. It was a wise move. Before leaving for Italy, he formally converted to Christianity, but not Catholic Christianity. He chose Arian Christianity. This again, like his choosing Italy over the Avars, was a move aimed at promoting stability and predictable outcomes. Whilst Arian Christianity and Catholic Christianity were at odds with each other, they were close enough for him to be able to make bridges, bringing his people in officially to the Christian world that gave him and his descendants opportunities. To use Christian symbolism further, he established the day of the migration's beginning as Easter, Monday the 2nd of April, 568. It was a resurrection of the Lombard people, a new beginning, a new birth. The symbolism was intentional. It is clear that surviving Goths in the north of Italy, who had fought against the Byzantines in the Long War, wanted him to come. Some even declared their loyalty to the Lombards before they arrived, to unite against the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine general Narses, who had defeated the Goths and who now lived further south in Italy, was hated. The archaeological evidence suggests that in the wake of such a long war with the Byzantines in Italy, the garrisons along the border were left almost undefended. This was a land for the taking. According to Paul the Deacon, in his Historia, Alboin and his Lombards came through the Julian Alps, which today form most of the border between Italy and Slovenia. They set up a center of Lombard rule at Cividale de Friuli, in the modern-day province of Udine. It was the first Lombard foothold in Italy, holding a strategic border pass. The Lombards were about to build a kingdom. As for Queen Rosamund, she would soon have her revenge. But her revenge, and the kingdom that followed, is what happened to the Lombards in Italy. This was the story of how they got to Italy. We will see you next time for that story. Thank you to my Patreons on the screen.